So she is an AI thought leader. She is a machine learning scientist, deputy CEO of a company called Smart Eye, former co-founder and CEO of Affectiva, and author of a book called Decoded, which in my view is one of the most important books you could read in the modern age. She is disrupting industries and humanizing technology with emotion AI. And now I basically feel totally inadequate, but I am delighted to be joined on AB Talks by Rana el Kaliouby. Rana, thank you for joining us. The first line of your About Rana on your website is kind of incredibly powerful. And if I read it, it's like, Rana's life work is about humanizing technology before it dehumanizes us. Which, can we start there? Because it feels like we're reaching an inflection point right now. I mean, we've got Senate hearings in the US about the harm that social media is doing to societies, the polarization, and most importantly, as a father, to our children. So just, how important is this mission right now that we fix this now?
We absolutely have to fix this now. So technology has done amazing and is doing amazing things for us and our, as society at large, but it's becoming mainstream. It's taking on roles that were traditionally done by humans. For example, helping you be more productive, helping you be healthier and happier. But a lot of the emphasis on technology today is on what I call the IQ, the cognitive intelligence of these machines. And nobody's really taking a human-centric approach and thinking about how is that affecting the way we connect and communicate with one another. So if you look at social media, it's really resulting or accentuating polarization in the world. It's accentuating, people are just really mean with each other online. And a lot of that is impacting actually our health, our mental health, and on our sense of worth and self-esteem, and it has to change. So I'm a huge advocate for humanizing technology and thinking about the emotional and social aspects of the technology we're building and how it impacts our ability to empathize with one another and our ability to connect with one another.
I mean, literally, there is so much to unpack, even in that opening statement. I mean, the general public could be forgiven right now for thinking that all algorithms are evil, and actually the matrix begins to look more and more. I can't believe that was 20 years ago as well. It makes me feel so old if you say, but that all AI is evil. But is it, or has it just been weaponized by profiteers to a degree?
Yeah, all AI is not evil. I mean, AI is just another tool or technology that can be used for good or evil. And it's up to us, the AI thought leaders, the innovators, the business leaders, to decide on where we want to spend our mind share, kind of designing and deploying these AI systems. So I'll give you an example in my space. And I'm in the artificial emotional intelligence space. So I'm trying to get machines to understand human emotions. There are applications of this technology in autism to help autistic kids read and understand, facial behaviors and facial signals. But there's applications of this technology in surveillance and lie detection, and it can be used to discriminate against people. We get to decide which of these applications we want to spend time, money, and effort on. And I feel strongly that, we have to think about the ethics of all of this.
And if we see what some tech giants have done with the existing, unemotional AI, that's perhaps what is worrying. Or there's a guy called Blair Shepherd, who's the chief strategy officer for PwC, talks about the unintended consequences of technology. So moving forward, how do we kind of teach? I mean, it almost seems like we need to teach technology to be better than ourselves, because you talk about emotional intelligence. We as human beings seem to be struggling with that. Can we actually teach machines to be actually better at this than we are?
I think it's going to take a while before machines are actually really better than we are, but the way I think about it is technology ought to augment humans, not replace humans. So if I can provide you or an organization with a tool that helps you become more empathetic, then it doesn't replace your ability to empathize. It just helps you become more empathetic. The unintended consequences, in my opinion, though, is really key. So a couple of years ago, we joined a consortium called the Partnership on AI, which was started by all the tech giants. It's a global organization, and it's they're partnered with Amnesty International and ACLU and other civil liberty organizations, and a number of startups like Affectiva. And we sat around the table and we said, okay, so emotion AI has a lot of applications: autism, advertising, automotive, you name it.
Yeah.
Where are we going to draw the line? And we literally created a spreadsheet where every row was a use case. And then we tried to think about, where can this go wrong? And then how are we going to preempt that? And I don't think a lot of the technology that's in the world today and the people behind it went through this exercise. They basically said, let's put it out there and see how it gets used.
Yeah.
And then it was like, oh no, like, how can we undo this? And it's hard to undo.
Yeah, because I mean, look, social media. Well, I was one of, you know, I was one of that first generation that came onto Facebook when Facebook first arrived, which was some time ago. And back then, it was all about the positive aspects of what you talk about connecting people, and, you know, being connected to your families and connected to friends that you've not seen for years and that sort of thing. And then here we are, sort of 2 decades later, with democracies being impacted by social media, societies being polarized. So there's supposed to be a question in there somewhere. Do you think then it's beholden? Do you have hope that the startups now are learning lessons from the incumbents that have made these mistakes? And when they perhaps set out on this journey, they didn't mean to make these mistakes, but we are where we are.
Yeah, I think the tech landscape has changed for a whole host of reasons. First of all, there's a huge tech backlash from consumers, right? And more scrutiny from the consumers, which is awesome. It's one of the reasons why I wrote my book. I wrote it for a broad audience because I wanted the average consumer to have a basic understanding of AI and some of the questions to ask around ethics and the ethics of these technologies. So that's a difference. So I think you can't get away with it if you wanted to just build another, basically, Facebook.
Yeah.
And then I also think the investor community has changed as well. Yeah. So investors that are funding these startups are asking, wait, what is your approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion? How are you thinking about mitigating data and algorithmic bias? And that's awesome. I think that's going to incentivize companies to think about this. And then finally, regulation. We're starting to see more regulatory frameworks, starting with the EU.
Yes.
And I think we're going to see more of that.
Do you think we've reached an inflection point then in terms of, I mean, I literally this week, I must have had 3 conversations about, you know, with tech giants, IBM and SAP, and talking about sustainability and technology. Have we reached an inflection point with ESG and the like, where, you know, every stakeholder now is an activist? So it doesn't matter if it's your customer or your employee, or indeed your partners in your supply chains, but almost everyone now is an activist. And we've kind of just all had enough of that 1980s greed is good, rape the planet, just profiteer at all costs. You can't get away with it anymore.
I 100% agree with that. I'm seeing that in the AI space for sure. And then I'm also part of the World Economic Forum Young Global Leaders, and that is consistently part of the narrative. Like, how can we endorse this responsible leadership framework where we place value on all the stakeholders, including our communities in which, you know, we operate in as a business. So I think this is great. I've always endorsed that. From, you know, my background is in academia. I started this, the very first application was in autism. And so I really believe in the technology and I want to see it used for good.
I will dive into the technology in a minute. I'm just really fascinated by the societal things. Are you seeing a generational thing as well? Because if I look at the corporate world en masse, you know, we've got the millennials and we've got the Gen Zs, who in many ways are actually far braver and far more passionate than my generation, perhaps, and the generation before me were. That was a kind of about profit making a living, where we've now got, you know, young people coming into professions who actually care and are actually taking a stand. So is this change coming at companies in corporations, whether they like it or not.
Yes, I 100% agree. And we're seeing that, yeah, consistently. So I have an 18-year-old daughter, and she is first and foremost a social justice warrior, right? And all her friends are. It's just incredible. You can't get away with saying anything that is remotely politically incorrect, right? You just get a whole lecture. But I think that's amazing. And at Affectiva and Smart Eye, now the company that acquired my company, we have a program where we bring high school students and undergraduates for the summer as interns. And it just gives you a very different perspective on how to build and design these technologies. So I feel very strongly that we need to be more inclusive of youth voices.
Yeah,
because they're the ones who are going, that they're the ones who grew up with technology being part of their lives, and they should be an active voice in how we design it.
This is one of the kind of drivers for me that sort of scares me a little bit. I've got a boy who's at university. If he calls me a boomer one more time, we will have words. I'm a Gen, not a boomer, but he's just about navigated perhaps social media and grown up. We've seen him grow up for a child. And I think he just missed the wave where it's really bad. But I've got a 5-year-old girl as well who's growing up, and she's going to be growing up into this world where, the social media is stitched into everything, which to me makes your book, Girl Decoded, and the work you're doing even more important, because we've got to build a better place for them to grow up in. Otherwise, they're going to be, all the things that the US Senate have been talking about now are going to just get worse.
I think by the time she's a teenager, we are going to see different social media platforms. I mean, I think we're starting already with the pandemic to see a lot more innovation in how we connect and communicate with one another digitally and online. And we're going to continue to see really innovative technologies that leverage things like emotion AI and these 90% of how we communicate is nonverbal, and it's split between your facial expressions, your body posture, your vocal intonation. All of that gets lost in cyberspace when we connect online. So I'm seeing a lot of innovation and like really cool startups that are incorporating this into into like communication platforms. And I'm excited to see, how that's going to scale and, roll out. And also, like, how do we quantify empathy when we're online? And for the first time ever, we can now start to measure these things and come up with empathy scores and A/B tests to see if you do this, do you create more empathy and more connection or not? So it'll all be fixed by the time your daughter is 12. There we go.
Goodness, I hope so. And and basically, Ron, I'm going to hold you to that one. I'm going to check back in a few years' time and go, Rana, you said this would all be fixed. I found some of the things that you've written utterly fascinating. Like, we live in this consequence-less world now, where we can just almost like anonymously say anything. And we have, you write about, you open your book, Girl Decoded, in an incredibly powerful way, talking about a story about teenagers who just ignored a guy drowning in the lake. We're laughing about it, and we've become this kind of like emotionally disconnected. But your mission and where you come at it is like, we need to teach the technology to almost as if we need to be reminded of the example of what we should be again, that being cold and emotionless is actually not the state that we should be pursuing.
Yeah, there's a school of thought that basically says we need to spend less time on technology. We need to do away with connecting, using everything, using technology for all things we do. I just don't think that that's practical or realistic. So, do we need to be more mindful of the number of hours we spend on our phones and devices? Absolutely. But if you look at the trends, we're each going to own even more devices in the future. And I'm already seeing that with my kids. So I think the solution is not to throw away technology, but it's to redesign technology in a way that interacts with humans just the way we interact with one another, through conversation. We're already seeing that with Siri and Alexa and other devices like that. But also perception and empathy. I think we just need to redesign technology to interact with us on our own terms, not with its own terms.
Do you think we've got so almost like conditioned to like, because we can talk and we can talk to technology, we can treat technology however we want, and it's almost like there was a passage I think I read on your website which was, it kind of really spoke to me in a way. It's like, you know, no longer will we be able to, will it be socially acceptable to scream at Alexa because she'll come back to you and go, you're hurting my feelings. I mean, I'm really glad that my mouse doesn't have feelings, because if it did, I'd probably be examining my behavior at times, because there have been times I've been a little bit grumpy at my machine. But this whole idea that, you know, we need to come full circle on our interactions and build empathy back into the center of our lives and how we communicate. Carry on, please carry on with what you're saying in that book, because that sounds absolutely like, I don't think there's anybody here that hasn't had a bit of computer rage at some point.
Rage is okay. I endorse the entire spectrum of our human emotions, and there's power and magic in each of them. But I will also say that if you don't use a muscle, it atrophies. So if we're spending all this time in front of our machines, but we're not practicing our social skills, we're not practicing how to look people in the eye, we're not practicing how to be polite and empathetic, it's all going to go away. So that's my concern, right? I think we need to start to bring back empathy into every interaction we have, including our online digital interactions. And that kind of calls for rethinking technology so that it does have social and emotional intelligence.
Social and emotional intelligence. I kind of said before, and I'll come on to mental health in a bit, but if we talk about leadership in a way, because obviously, and you write in your book, you know, you were writing about the book, you know, emotional intelligence as a book. We're still not there. I mean, that was a decade ago that book was written, and we're still not there in terms of leaderships. We've got many toxic workplaces. People are still turning up to, you know, to office environments and not feeling psychologically safe. And then there's not empathy in workplaces. And yet we've got the research that tells us that if we actually embrace empathy and we exercise that muscle that you talk about, companies actually make more money. This is the thing that I just don't understand. Like, the more anxious people are, the less well they perform, and the more psychologically safe they feel, the more empathy there is in a newsroom. Oh, sorry, a newsroom. Well, that's my industry. So,
right, I love it.
But in any organization, you actually make the company does better. The health of the employees and the bottom line both benefit. And Gary,
yeah, go ahead. No. Go ahead. I love this.
And then I wanted to ask. Because you're actually, we're talking about societal things, but how can you and companies use emotion, AI, and technology to actually advance that conversation within organizations?
I love this. So I think we are seeing a rise of what I'm calling an empathy economy, where organizations that are able to leverage empathy as a superpower are driving more economic value for their stakeholders. And that could be empathy, as you said, in the workplace, like making your team members feel psychologically safe and connected, especially in the increasingly hybrid remote world environment.
Yeah.
But also empathy in how you connect with your customers and your consumers and your partners. And I think if you're able to convert that empathy, if you're able to actually execute on that empathy kind of promise, you are just going to be ahead of the competition. The challenge is if you're a small mom and pop shop and you know your customers in person, it's very easy to practice empathy. It's really hard to scale empathy. And this is where technology can play a role. This is where emotion AI can help you quantify empathy at scale with all of your customers. It can help you tap into the emotional engagement of your readers or students or employees. And again, I think the pandemic has really accelerated the need for technology like this to quantify and scale empathy. So
is there the argument? I mean, I think the word I've heard the most, which gives me a great deal of hope that's come out of the pandemic, is purpose and how companies can live their purpose. And I think there are a number of companies out there that don't really know how to get you even get started, don't even know how to open that door. So can technology and emotion AI help them begin that journey?
Yes, we work with 2/3 of the Fortune Global 500 companies around the world. And basically, we help them measure the emotional engagement their consumers and their viewers have with their content and with their brand. So and we found during the pandemic that the companies that did best were the ones where their message was about their product or their service, but it was tied to this grander purpose, and they were able to action that. So essentially what we do is, if you had a video ad and you wanted to get a sense of how people respond to it, we ask for people's permission to turn their cameras on while they're watching. And then we're able to quantify moment by moment their emotional expressions. And then we aggregate all of that, and we can say, oh, when at the scene when, you had this purpose statement come out and people were like, oh, or they were like, right? Like, depending on their response, you can really quantify that emotional engagement.
And I mean, I find it absolutely fascinating, and my mind gets kind of like blown by this whole thing. But sometimes it almost feels like this technology knows us better than we know ourselves in some points. I think you talked about in your book, you talk about semi-autonomous cars that can tell that we're angry and kind of take control a little bit and like slow us down and go, whoa, you shouldn't be doing that.
It's a partnership. Again, I really do think, most people are not really self-aware and don't really take the time to reflect on their emotions and their emotional well-being. We just don't. So technology could almost bootstrap that, right? And be able to, in the same way we wear our Fitbits and our,
absolutely, yeah.
Our physical activity tracking devices, and it can tell you, oh, you haven't, Scott, you haven't been exercising for the last 5 days. I'm sure you don't do that. But it can provide data to make it an objective statement, right? Yeah. And nudge you to change your behavior. We don't have an equivalent for your emotional well-being, right? And I think we're at a point where it would be really awesome to have something that helps you track mental health.
Totally agree with you on that, Rana. I think that's an absolutely amazing idea. Someone needs to make that happen. And I wanted to talk about mental health, because increasingly we're a knowledge economy. We dig far fewer roads than we used to road. So we're using our brains all the time. So is that the next stage for emotion AI? Emotion AI to help us actually be emotionally intelligent? Because we can see around the world, we have got a massive mental health crisis. 1 in 4 of us, and actually here in the UAE, the figure is that 1 in 3 of us will be impacted by mental health at some point. So how can emotion AI and how can technology step in? And because in your book as well, when you open your book saying that actually you were trying to teach, or you were trying to humanize AI, and that forced you to confront your own emotions.
Yes, this is such a big topic, and it's one I'm very passionate about. I actually believe one of the kind of most transformative use cases of emotion AI is in the mental health space. I want you to think about this, right? Like when you walk into a doctor's office today, the doctor doesn't ask you, Scott, what's your blood pressure? What's your temperature? They just measure it. We have sensors for measuring these vital signs. Unfortunately, in mental health, the gold standard is still a self-reported survey on a scale from 1 to 10. How depressed are you, or how stressed are you?
Yeah.
And it's very subjective, and because of the stigma around mental health, people aren't really forthcoming with truthful answers. And we can do better with technology. We know that there are facial and vocal biomarkers of stress, anxiety, depression, other diseases like Parkinson's. We could quantify this. And given the fact that we are kind of tethered to our machines and our phones, for better or worse, it's an opportunity to capture this baseline data. And if you deviate from it, it can flag it to you, to a doctor, to a loved one or a partner, with your consent, of course. So I just think there's a lot of opportunity in that space. And
well, this is where you also have the opportunity to employ nudge theory and actually, was it paternal libertarianism? I can never quite remember what the phrase is, but how you can help people make better choices for themselves.
Definitely. Absolutely.
I'm just going to turn my mind back on because again, it's been blown once again. We're speaking during Expo 2020, and that's happening here in the UAE. You know, the themes are sustainability, mobility, and opportunity, and it feels like Emotion AI can talk to all three of those topics. Where do you think Emotion AI? Well, it feels like technology. It's not. It's always going to be part of our lives moving forward anyway.
Absolutely. It really, it has applicability across industry. It's transforming multiple industries. I'll start with mobility as an example, because that's an area where we're spending a lot of time. So my company got acquired by SmartEye, which is the global leader in eye tracking for mobility applications, like detecting if a driver is distracted or drowsy.
Yeah.
And the car can intervene in real time and help make our roads safer. So that's an area that's really cool. And it applies to the cars today. It applies to semi-autonomous vehicles. And it actually has great applicability with fully autonomous vehicles and robotaxis, which I know the UAE is very invested in. I don't know if you know that.
This is literally my childhood come to life. It's amazing.
I don't know if you know that I grew up in the Middle East. I'm originally from Egypt, but grew up in Abu Dhabi. So my parents are still there, actually.
Oh wow, yeah.
We spent a fair amount of time in Dubai.
I wanted to ask you. I mean, you sort of semi-auto answered my question before I even got there. You're obviously reading the face with your computer, and but I wanted it because I'm so fascinated about your work with Smart Eye. Just tell us a little bit more around that, because again, this is not just, it's beyond cutting edge as far as I can see.
Yeah, you can imagine how if your car had a camera sensor and actually it's now kind of being plugged into the rear view mirror. So imagine your rear view mirror has a little camera sensor. It doesn't record any video. So obviously for privacy reasons, but it's able to detect in real time. It will track, for example, the driver's blink rate, or, are you doing this? Because if you're doing this, you're texting while driving and you really shouldn't be. So it can detect these signals in real time, and then literally the car can intervene and it's kind of interesting. We partner with a lot of car companies, and some car companies will just show you a coffee cup to suggest that you should maybe stop for coffee because you're too tired, all the way to semi-autonomous vehicles that will literally, the car will say, okay, you're too tired to drive. It's too dangerous. Me, the car, is going to take over, and I'm going to drive for the next 15 minutes. You power nap, and then when you're up again, you can take control again. So it's really fascinating, the spectrum of actions the car can take when it detects these activities.
I mean, look, as you say, you grew up in this part of the world. I can see quite a lot of applications about, particularly around angry driving in this part of the world, where that could really help.
Absolutely. Road rage is a thing.
Indeed. Okay, so I mean, how does it feel to you? I mean, to be working. I mean, you're not at the forefront. You're literally on the boundary. You're pushing boundaries. How does that feel to be working in this field where what you do could shape literally future generations?
I think the word that comes to mind is it's both a privilege and a responsibility. I love it. I really do believe there is incredible potential for good that could come out of this technology. And this is what drives me out of bed every day. Yeah. But I also know it can go seriously wrong if we don't do it right. And so I do feel it's a responsibility. Back to kind of one of the themes of the expo, there's a lot of opportunity too, and this ought to be inclusive. I mean, one of the things I love about the UAE is they have an AI minister, they have a happiness minister. They're really invested in kind of combining, technology and humanity to do what's best for society. So I make it inclusive, right? Like bring diverse voices to the table to help us craft this right. So
I have to apologize for being old, male and white on this call as well, because I know there's too many of those in the tech industry as well. But you and you're right what you say about the UAE, in terms of there's a lot of ambition in this part of the world as well, because we've got such a young population. So when you look back at the UAE, your parents are still here, you're looking back at this region, how much innovation are you seeing coming out of this region? Because we have got, and we've got a massive amount of entrepreneurs out here right now. We've got a lot of young people who don't just want to go and work for a company, they actually want to make a difference.
I mean, the cool thing about technology and AI is that the barrier for entry is actually pretty low. Like, you don't need a humongous factory. You don't need to be kind of producing and manufacturing hardware. So it's software, and the barrier to entry is low, assuming that you can get access to the data you need and the talent you need. And I would say the UAE is really investing in the entire ecosystem, everything from the investor community to supporting and subsidizing startups to be, to basically hire and grow in the region or in the country.
Yeah.
And I think we need that. We need diverse founders, and we need diverse startups that are, taking fresh approaches to solving problems. So yeah, I'm obviously a big proponent of that. I also serve on the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund. So it was a fund supported by the US government to invest in small and medium businesses in Egypt. It's primarily focused on Egyptian startups, but the same idea applies, right? We're just seeing really creative solutions coming out of the region.
Yeah.
Solving, local problems. So that's great.
If you look at the year ahead, what frightens you? What excites you? Is it the same thing?
Well, what frightens me is data and algorithmic bias. I mean, if we're really not careful with this, we can accidentally build bias into all our algorithms, and then we deploy them in vehicles or in, technologies across the world. And before you know it, you've exacerbated biases that exist in society. So to me, that's the thing we really need to be intentional about. What excites me the most, honestly, it's the application. It's like the application of emotion AI. I mean, we talked about mental health. That's a really exciting area. I'm spending more and more time in that space. And in other areas like online learning and education and telehealth. So yeah.
And again, I am no expert, though many people would say that most of my intelligence is indeed artificial. What haven't I asked you yet that I should have asked you?
I think we've covered a lot of ground.
We have, and I could keep going, but I understand, but our time is finite. Most exciting thing about the year ahead then? So you talked about what frightens you and how it can go wrong. What's the really super exciting thing you think is going to shape the agenda in the next 24 months?
I mean, I think AI is at a point where it can be really applied and leveraged really across industry. So I'm excited to find these low-hanging opportunities where companies and organizations can incorporate AI into their practices. We're calling it like AI first organizations. So I'm spending a lot of time, just kind of helping organizations become AI focused and AI first.
Okay, Rana, I mean, I literally could talk about this stuff all night, but I'm sure you're really busy. AB Talks, thank you for joining us today at Arabian Business. And for anyone tuning in, behind Rana's shoulder, you can see a book there called Girl Decoded. I genuinely recommend you read it because it's fantastic and incredibly important. Read it to your daughters and read it to your sons. Rana, thank you so much for joining us on AB Talks.
Thank you, Scott, for having me.
You're very welcome.